We start today with a story from the ancient Buddhist scripture, the Dhammapada, about Kisa Gotami. Kisa was a young woman. She had a child, about a year old, who died. And she was distraught to the point of madness, as you might imagine she would be. She carried her baby from place to place, searching for someone who could heal her child and revive her child. She was eventually told to go see the Buddha so that she could get help. He said, "It's possible to revive your child. You just need to bring me mustard seeds." But they need to be mustard seeds from a home where no one has experienced death. Kisa went out, searched from home to home, from village to village, and as you might imagine, came back empty. And in that moment, she understood the nature of suffering and of life. As a cultural psychologist, studying and teaching and researching in places as far afield as Ghana and Egypt and India, the United States, and now here in the Balkans, one of the things that interests me the most is how different cultures understand what life is about, what we should expect out of life, and what it means to have a good life. And this varies, as you might imagine, from culture to culture. As an American, I'm interested in how that contrasts with how American psychology sees things. Americans are, without question, the most independent, autonomous, disconnected people of any people I have met in the world. I was speaking with a woman in Ghana who asked me a question, and she asked it very sincerely. It wasn't judgmental. She just really wanted to know. She said, "Here in Ghana, a lot of people struggle, a lot of people suffer. They have poverty, they have health problems, they have life problems, need for food, all these things. But Ghanaian people are very cheerful." She said, "It seems to me that Americans have something very small happen to them and they fall apart. Why are Americans so fragile?" There are, of course, a lot of answers to that, but the answer I want to talk to you about today is how Americans are taught to expect life to be, what normal life looks like. Americans are taught that normal life is happy, or at least most of the time. Normal life is free of anxiety, at least most of the time. And this has important implications for how they understand the world and how American psychology understands people. First, we have that suffering is a sign that something is wrong. Because if you are happy and free of anxiety, that's normal life. If you're not happy and you're anxious, something must be wrong. The second, we don't know how to respond to the suffering of others. I'll talk about this more a little bit later, but when we view problems as happening within an individual, we find it difficult to know how to respond to the suffering of other people. And the third, we feel separated from others when we struggle. First, a sign that something is wrong. We can look at some different ways in which people tend to see or interpret somebody's life or the problems they have as a sign that something is wrong. First, psychological. Psychological problems could be diagnoses that are passed around a lot now because of people's access to the internet and these diagnoses. There's a lot of self-diagnosing, depression, anxiety, ADHD. These are some of the most popular of those. But we assume that if somebody is struggling or suffering, there must be something psychologically wrong with them. They must have a mental illness of some kind. A second is biological. There's no culture I've been around or know about in the world that is as quick to attribute biochemical causes to human suffering. Americans are taught, sometimes told by therapists and doctors, that they have a chemical imbalance. Chemical imbalance is usually referring to the neurotransmitter levels in the brain, but maybe it'll surprise you to know that there is no test of brain chemistry levels in a living human brain. You can't test it. So if somebody has told you you have a chemical imbalance, that's an idea they have, but I promise you they didn't do a chemical balance test because there isn't one. The third Americans are really tied to this idea that happy people are good people and good people are happy people. So if you're unhappy or you're struggling, you must be doing something wrong or you must be something wrong. Now, this leads us to a second issue, that we don't know how to respond to the suffering of others. I had a close friend who went through just an unimaginable tragedy, and I remember just feeling paralyzed. I did not know what to do. I knew I was one of his closest friends. I didn't know what to say. I'd never gone through what he went through, and I found myself, like many Americans do, not doing anything. Now, what happens then if we can't respond to the suffering of other people is that we are alone at the time we need it the very most. And I eventually reached out to this friend, but I felt that I was leaving him out, and I was. So this also leads us to find it difficult to have conversations about struggle and suffering. I've noticed that a lot of teenagers and young adults who are talking about feelings of despair and even suicide find it difficult to talk to adults because they tend to medicalize and psychologize the problem rather than empathize with them, feeling like they need to send them to a doctor to cure them of their despair rather than having a meaningful conversation about how the person feels. A third issue is that negative feelings separate us from each other. We tend to have this problem that since we view these negative emotions as happening within people, that we can't understand what other people are going through, and they can't understand what we are going through. Now, you should know this if you interact with Americans. You should never say to somebody who's suffering, "I know how you feel." It's a kind of cultural blasphemy, really, and people will get offended because the idea is you can't know how I feel because you're not me. Now, of course, what that means is when I'm suffering, when I'm struggling, nobody understands me and I'm totally alone. This has got to contribute to what the US Surgeon General has reported. He made a report titled "An Epidemic of Loneliness and Isolation in America." Now, is there another way? The challenge of finding this other way is that when you have a culture that teaches certain values and those values cause problems for people, it's difficult to find the solution within that culture. Because most of what we do in America to help people who are suffering is to increase their sense of individuality, separation, and we teach them that the problems they have are happening within their own bodies and their own psyches, increasing the problem rather than solving it. But luckily, American culture isn't the only thing in the world, even though it sometimes seems like it. So I will share with you some ideas. There are many, but a few ideas from some of the places that I've been in my career. First, let's bring us back to Kisa Gotami. What do we learn from her story? Well, we learn that suffering is normal. What does that mean? It means that in many cultures, take depressive symptoms that are difficult, challenging, frustrating, even debilitating. They don't like them, but they think of those as a normal part of human life. So when life is really difficult, that's life. And it means that there's not something wrong with you because you're suffering. It just means that you're living life and life is difficult. There are other psychologists who teach this as well in different cultures, but the idea here is life is hard. So when it isn't going great, that's because life is hard, not because you're failing at it, not because you're not doing a good enough job. A second, well, this brings us to this book I read. I have to admit I didn't read the whole book, but I remember seeing this book a lot in the 80s. It was a very catchy title. It said, "I'm okay, you're okay." I think I would like to rephrase that book's title. Hopefully it's as catchy. I'm not okay, you're not okay, and that's okay. A second issue that we find a solution in, this time in Indian psychology, is this problem of seeing suffering and difficulties and mental health problems as existing within the psyche or the skin of the individual. To give an example of how that looks for people who view it this way, if I say I love you to someone, then I'm referring to an action that's happening within me, within my psyche, within my body, within my heart. It may refer to another person, but it's something about me that's going on, because the emotions exist within my own psyche, within my own body. Indian psychology teaches something different. The psychologist Girishwar Mishra talks about how in Indian psychology, emotions are seen as existing between individuals, not within individuals. And the emotions are an indication of the relationship between the two people rather than revealing the inner states of individuals. When I was in elementary school, I hit my head really hard at school. I got a concussion and was really sick. And I remember when I was in the nurse's office, I was in a lot of pain, I was nauseated, I had all these problems, but I wasn't sad until my mother showed up. And then I cried. Because, of course, the tears weren't revealing an inner state, but were an indication of the relationship I had with my mother. My tears were for her, or more accurately, my tears were about us. If we saw it this way, it makes it easier for us to relate to the suffering of others, because of course when we care about somebody and they suffer, we suffer with them. We no longer have to say, you can't know how I feel. If I suffer and somebody loves me, of course they know how I feel. They're suffering with me. This would make it easier. Let me give you an example of when I lived in Egypt. As is common to the culture there, one of my students walked in my office without knocking, but I had just before that received a phone call that my father had died of cancer. And I was, as you might imagine, upset and crying, and she came in and she said, "What's wrong?" I said, "Oh, my father passed away. I just got the phone call." She immediately sprung into action. Within 5 minutes, there were half a dozen students in my office. They spent hours with me. One of them even brought food and drinks, and they cried with me and mourned with me. I brought this scenario up with some American students once and said, "What would it be like for you if you showed up at my door in my office and I was crying?" And they all just went, oh, sorry, as if they would run away from my suffering. I wondered about that because I don't believe that my American students are less caring as people, but definitely really uncomfortable with the suffering of their professor. A third problem we find solved by another culture is a little closer to us culturally, from a guy named Viktor Frankl. He was an Austrian psychiatrist. He also was in concentration camps in World War II. And he argued that in his life experiences, the thing he learned was that suffering in life is unavoidable, but that this unavoidable suffering is an important place to find meaning in our lives. He used to even ask some patients of his, "Why are you still alive?" I had a young man speak to me recently who talked about this same issue in his own life. Imagine yourself in his situation as he explained feelings of despair and hopelessness, not even sure that he thought life was worth living. I asked him, "Why are you still alive?" He said, "Well, I'd feel bad for my family." I said, "Well, why would you feel bad for your family?" "Well, because they would be sad." "Why would they be sad?" "Well, because they care about me." I said, "Okay. Well, why would you feel bad for making them feel sad?" "Well, because I care about them." And I said, love from your family and to your family seems like a good place to start your life, and I think can form a basis for where you go from here. These are the kind of conversations we have to be able to have, and Americans especially tend to find quite difficult. Viktor Frankl said that in American culture, there's very little place for the suffering person to be seen as noble, so that Americans not only feel depressed, which is normal, but they're depressed about being depressed. They're not only anxious, but they're anxious about being anxious. So I imagine that there are some of you here, either in this audience or listening to this talk, who are suffering, who are struggling. Some maybe as deeply as Kisa Gotami did, where you feel suffering to the point of madness. But I want you to know there's nothing wrong with you. It's just that life is difficult. And I want you to know that you are not alone, because the people that care about you suffer with you. And I want you to know, even though maybe this doesn't sound great, you're not unique. because everybody suffers. But that lack of uniqueness means you're not alone in your darkest times. In fact, your suffering makes you like everybody else. It unites you with the rest of the world. If you want to be unique, never suffer. Of course, that's not possible. In the end, I think we may find ourselves at times, and luckily not all times, there are great joyous times in life as well. We may find ourselves crying out that we are not okay. And I just want you to know that's okay. Thank you.